The lights are on. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Every time I lift my head and look through the windshield at those walls, at those container stacks lined up 30 feet high with floodlights bolted every 20 meters. Every single time I think, somebody's home. Somebody left the lights on. They're in there. They can see us. They are choosing not to open that gate. I've been sitting here for an hour and 12 minutes. I know, because the dash clock is still running off the truck's battery, and I've been watching it the way I used to watch the call queue at 0300, when everything was supposed to be quiet and nothing ever was. Rook is in the passenger seat with his chin on the armrest, looking at the gate the same way I am, like he's waiting for it to make sense. It's not going to make sense. I know that. I've known it since about 30 minutes in, when I counted the cameras for the third time and noticed they were moving, not sweeping on a timer, actually tracking, following us as we drove the perimeter, slow and quiet with the headlights off so we didn't pull anything in from the dark behind us. The cameras on the northwest corner turned a full 90 degrees to keep us in frame. Someone is sitting at a monitor right now. Someone is watching me talk to myself in an armored truck in the parking lot of what used to be the Fairfield Agricultural Processing Complex, which is now supposedly the most secured civilian refuge east of Columbus. I'm going to keep recording. I don't know who this is for. Habit, maybe. I spent 11 years sitting at a console, telling people what was happening in real time, because the act of saying it out loud made the information real, made it something you could work with. I'm doing the same thing now, talking into the dash recorder like someone at a dispatch center is going to pick up and say, "Priority 1 acknowledged, Owen, help is on the way." Nobody's picking up. I want to explain how we got here. Not for the recording, for me, because if I start from the beginning, I might find something I missed, some decision point where I could have done this differently, taken a different road, arrived an hour earlier, before whatever happened inside those walls happened. Or maybe I'll just find out there was never a different road, and this was always where the road ended. A lit-up gate at 11:43 at night, with 5 people, and a dog on the wrong side of it. Let me start from Thursday. Thursday, September the 14th. I was at the console, second floor of the Columbus Emergency Communications Center, the one on Broad Street with the parking garage that always smelled like exhaust and wet concrete. My shift started at 6 in the morning, and was supposed to end at 2 in the afternoon, and I was on my 3rd coffee and my 7th hour, dealing with a situation on the east side that kept spawning new calls. That's how we talked about it, spawning. 1 call becomes 3, becomes 10. A traffic accident spawns a road rage incident, spawns a pedestrian down. You get a feel for which ones are going to keep going, and which ones are going to die quietly after 2 units respond. This one didn't die. It started at 6:17. Animal attack, caller said. A man near the intersection of Livingston and Kelton. Caller said the man was biting people. She said it twice, which is when I started actually listening instead of processing. Biting is not a category that gets you immediately slotted in the right box. Could be a psychotic episode, could be a PCP situation, could be a seizure, causing involuntary muscle response. I dispatched a unit and flagged a supervisor. By 6:45, I had 3 more calls from the same general area, not related to the first, or so I thought. Different intersections, different callers, but the description was the same each time. Not just aggressive, not just erratic, biting, moving wrong, one caller said. I asked her what she meant by moving wrong. She said, "I don't know, like they don't feel it when you push them." She was crying. I remember how her voice sounded, high and squeezed, like someone was pressing on her chest. I kept the line open while I dispatched a second unit, and I heard a sound in the background that I still hear sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. It wasn't screaming. It was more like the absence of a response to pain. She hit something and I heard the impact, and what I didn't hear was the thing reacting. By 8 o'clock, we were at 43 calls citywide. By 9:30, we were at 300, and the system was starting to stagger under the weight of it. And my supervisor, Kevin Arndt, a guy I'd worked with for 7 years who used to bring in breakfast sandwiches on Fridays, was standing in the middle of the room saying over and over, "Triage, triage, Prioritize mass casualty events first. And he looked like he hadn't fully woken up yet. Like this couldn't actually be happening, so he was still in some prefrontal cortex state of not quite believing his own eyes. I kept taking calls because what else do you do? You're on the console. You stay on the console. At 10:14, a patrol officer called in to report that he had discharged his weapon 6 times at an individual who kept advancing. He sounded not scared exactly, more like the version of scared that's so far past the normal threshold that it's flattened out into this weird, stunned calm. I know that voice. I'd heard it twice before in 11 years. Once from a firefighter who'd come out of a building after the floor collapsed, and once from a paramedic after a 7-car pileup that involved a school bus. The voice that sounds like someone reciting a grocery list, because everything else has been used up. He said, "I don't understand. I don't understand, dispatch." And then his radio went quiet. I tried to raise him for 12 minutes. Nothing. Somewhere in there, my personal phone buzzed in my pocket. I wasn't supposed to have it out during a shift, but I'd been checking it since about 7 o'clock, because Amy had texted me at 6:50, saying there was something weird on the news, and she wasn't sure if she should go into her shift at the hospital. Amy was an ER nurse. She'd been working at Grant Medical Center for 4 years. I loved that about her, that she worked in emergency medicine, that we'd both chosen fields built around other people's worst moments. We used to joke that we were the only couple we knew who thought it was romantic to talk about crisis protocols over dinner. At 10:14, I checked my phone. She'd sent 8 more texts since 6:50. The last one was from 9:58, and it said, "Owen, I'm going in. They're calling everyone in. There are so many people coming through the doors. I'll call when I can. Love you." That was the last text I ever got from her. I'm going to say that plainly, because if I try to soften it or work around it, I'm going to spend 10 minutes doing it, and will never get to the gate. Amy went into Grant Medical Center on the morning of Thursday, September the 14th. I never spoke to her again. The hospital went dark. All communications. No calls. No responses to dispatch queries. At 11:32 that morning. By then, I had already tried her cell phone 11 times, and I already knew, in the way you know things when you've spent years working in the space between emergency calls and what they mean, that unanswered calls from that building weren't a technical issue. I kept working until 12:20, when Kevin told everyone to get out. He said it in a voice I'd never heard from him before. Not an announcement voice, not a supervisor managing a crisis voice, just a man's voice, raw and honest. He said, "Take your things, take your car, go to your families. We can't. Just go." Half the room was already empty. People had been slipping out since about 11 o'clock when the feeds from the city cameras started showing things that didn't need to be described over radio, because seeing them was already more than enough. I took the truck. That requires some explanation. There were 4 city emergency response vehicles in the parking garage. Big Ford F-550s with reinforced panels welded on. Not fancy military stuff, but solid. Bolted steel plating on the doors. Wire mesh over the windows. A push bar up front that could move a regular sedan like it was made of cardboard. We used them for disaster response. Flood situations. Structure fires where we needed to get close. They weren't mine to take. I had a department badge and a key code for the garage because I'd sometimes helped coordinate vehicle deployment from the floor. But taking one it was not a thing you were supposed to do. I took one anyway. Unit 7. I walked into the garage. I typed in the code. I got in, and I drove it out, and I didn't tell anyone. Kevin was still upstairs. The remaining dispatchers were still at their consoles. Or some of them were. I drove out of the garage at 12:27. I want to be clear about why I took it, and not my own car. My car was a 5-year-old Civic that would not have lasted a week. The truck was armored, had a full fuel tank, had a roof-mounted spotlight, and a siren, and emergency lights, and a radio rig that could hit frequencies my personal radio couldn't touch. It was the obvious choice. I'm not going to apologize for it. I don't think I could have survived the next 3 weeks without that vehicle, and if the city wanted it back, they could come ask me for it. My house was 20 minutes from the center. I made it in 11. My neighborhood by 12:40 on that Thursday. was not in full collapse yet, but it was getting there. I passed 2 car accidents in 4 blocks, both of them fresh, airbags deployed. A man was sitting on someone's front lawn holding his head. 3 houses down from mine, a woman was loading boxes into a minivan with the focused speed of someone who's already made the decision and just needs to execute it. She looked at me when I pulled up in the truck. I recognized her. Linda something. We'd waved at each other at the mailbox 100 times, and she looked at me like I was already from a different world. I grabbed what I could in the time I thought I had, which turned out to be about 14 minutes before I heard the first sounds I didn't want to hear, coming from the direction of the next block over. I'm going to tell you what I packed, and I'm going to be specific, because the specifics mattered, and because I'd been thinking about this kind of situation in a background process way for a long time, not in a prepper sense, more in the sense that when you work emergency services for 11 years, you develop a bone-deep awareness that systems fail, that the gap between normal and catastrophic is smaller than people want to believe. I didn't have a bunker. I had a mental list. Food first. I went through the kitchen fast. Canned goods. We had a decent stock. Amy was the kind of cook who kept a full pantry. 2 cases of canned soup, 3 of beans, 4 of vegetables, a case of tuna, pasta, rice in 2 5-pound bags, a big container of oatmeal, peanut butter, 4 jars, and every single protein bar in the cabinet, which turned out to be 11, because Amy bought them in bulk for her long hospital shifts. Cooking oil, salt, sugar, coffee. 2 large canisters of ground coffee, because I was going to need it, and I wasn't going to apologize for that either. Water. I had 2 5-gallon jugs under the sink that I kept for storm season. I filled them both and grabbed every water bottle in the house and a water filter straw I'd bought years ago and never used. Medical. First aid kit. Full. Prescription medications. I grabbed everything in the cabinet, including Amy's, and including things I didn't know what they did, on the theory that someone in the future might. Ibuprofen. Large bottles. 3 of them. Alcohol. Gauze. Tape. Her suture kit that she kept at home for practice, which I later became very grateful for. Tools. This is where I spent more time than I probably should have. I had a decent garage. Crowbar, hammer, bolt cutters, handsaw, zip ties, duct tape, 2 pairs of heavy gloves, 3 flashlights and a headlamp with extra batteries, a camp stove and 2 propane canisters, a hand-crank weather radio. Weapons. I had a shotgun I'd owned for 8 years and 2 boxes of shells. I'm not a gun person, but I'm not a not-gun person either. I knew how to use it because my father made sure I did, and I was glad of that, on the 14th of September. Clothes, packed fast, heavy on layers. And Rook. Rook was in the backyard. He'd been out there since 6 that morning, and he knew something was wrong. Belgian Malinois always know. They're basically walking threat detection systems, and he'd been pacing the fence line for hours, judging by the path he'd worn in the grass. He came to me when I opened the back door and pressed his head against my leg, and I put my hand on the back of his neck, and I stood there for about 15 seconds, doing nothing, because I needed those 15 seconds. He was 4 years old. I'd gotten him 3 years earlier from a search and rescue training program that had a surplus. Rook was too high drive for the civilian handlers they were placing dogs with. Too intense, too focused, too much dog. I was the one who could keep up with him. We trained together, ran together. He slept at the foot of the bed, and Amy used to complain that he took up more room than both of us combined, and she never actually minded. He jumped into the truck before I could open the door for him. I took that as a vote of confidence. I need to talk about Claire. Not yet, not her whole story. But I need to establish why she's the reason I'm sitting outside a locked gate at 11:43 at night instead of somewhere else. I don't know where. Somewhere that was as safe as anywhere gets now, which isn't very safe, but not this. Claire Briggs. My younger sister by 4 years, which made her 30 on September 14th. She worked in marketing for a mid-sized tech company in Columbus, lived in an apartment in the Short North neighborhood, and was, by most external measures, the more functional of the 2 of us. Better social skills, more friends. remembered birthdays, knew how to have a conversation at a party without mentally calculating the quickest exit route, which is a skill I never developed. She and I talked every Sunday. Not a long call, maybe 15-20 minutes. We'd done it since our mother died 5 years earlier, not by any explicit agreement, just by mutual drift toward it. I'd get a text Sunday morning, "Call me when you're up," and I would, and we'd catch up on whatever the week had been. I hadn't talked to her since the Sunday before the 14th. I called her at 12:38, from my driveway with the truck loaded and Rook in the passenger seat. Her phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. Her voicemail greeting was cheerful in a way that hit me wrong. She sounded so normal, so pre-Thursday. This recorded version of her from some Tuesday afternoon when the worst thing happening was a meeting she didn't want to attend. I left a message. I said, "Claire, it's Owen. I don't know where you are, but you need to get out of your apartment if you're there. Get to high ground. Lock yourself in. Call me. I'm coming." She was in the short north. That was 4 miles from the emergency center. Probably not good. I drove toward her apartment because, what else do? You go. I didn't make it there that day. A block from where I needed to turn off High Street, I came to a stop behind a line of cars that went as far as I could see, and the reason I could see the reason for it was the car at the front of the line was on fire, and both lanes were blocked, and there were bodies on the road between me and the turn, and there were things moving among the bodies that were not people, not anymore, not in any way that I could reconcile with people. The infected don't move the way you'd expect. That was the first time I'd seen them, and I want to describe this accurately because everything I'd processed over the radio that morning had prepared me for something that made more sense. Drug-induced aggression, maybe. Severe injury. Something with a cause and effect logic. What I saw moving through that intersection did not follow any logic I'd been trained for. They don't react to obstacles the way a person would. A person, if they walk into a car door, flinches, steps back, adjusts. These things hit the car and kept pushing. The car moved. A little, just rocked on its axles, and the thing pushing it kept pushing, like it had one instruction, and the instruction was, go toward the sound. I had my window cracked and I could hear. I need to think about how to describe this. It was like the sound of an argument happening in another room. That specific quality of human voice when it's been stripped of its human function. Not language, not even emotion exactly. Just this continuous audible output that had no shape to it. There were about 15 of them in that intersection, maybe more, behind the burning car that I couldn't see. I looked at my dash and I thought, very clearly, the way you think when you've been trained to stay functional in emergencies. I cannot get through here in time to do anything. Claire's apartment is 3 more blocks east. Driving east is not possible. If I go on foot and something happens to me, Claire has no one coming for her. If I go on foot and get through, I might find she's not even there. I turned the truck around. This is the decision that still finds me at 3 o'clock in the morning, not any of the later ones. This one. I turned the truck around and I told myself it was strategic and it was the correct call. I know it was. I couldn't have walked 3 blocks through that intersection and made it. And even if I had, she probably wasn't in her apartment anymore. Because Claire is not stupid. Claire would have left. But I still turned the truck around and drove away from the short north on the morning of the 14th. I'm not done carrying that. The first 3 days were about surviving the city. I'm going to move through this faster, because the city phase of this isn't the story I'm telling. The story I'm telling is how we ended up at this gate. But I need to give you enough of the city phase to understand how we got out. I found a place to hole up on the afternoon of the 14th, a self-storage facility on the west side. Store all. 8-foot chain link with razor wire. Single entrance with a heavy sliding gate. The facility manager's office had a back room with a cot and a hot plate, and a small supply of food, and I figured out within an hour of being there that the manager must have also been planning to use it as a refuge, because there were 2 5-gallon water jugs, 3 cases of canned goods, a hand radio, and a pump-action shotgun under the cot that wasn't mine. No manager. The key was in the lock. I took the space. Rook investigated every corner of the facility, and came back and sat in front of me and looked at me in the particular way he has of saying, "This is as good as it gets right now." I agreed. The storage units themselves were not immediately useful to me for food or supplies, but they became useful in another way. On the second day, when I started methodically going through them, people store everything. I found camping gear in 2 units, tents, sleeping bags, a camp stove, 4 propane canisters, water purification tablets. I found a unit full of someone's food storage, Mormon prepper setup, shelves of sealed buckets with mylar bags inside, white rice and wheat berries, and freeze-dried vegetables. That was in Unit 47. I sat in front of Unit 47 for a moment with something that felt almost like gratitude, but was mostly just relief, which is a different thing. I found a ham radio setup in Unit 83, transceiver, power supply, logbooks, 2 antennas. I knew enough about radio equipment from my dispatch work to get it running, and on the evening of the 14th, running off one of the facility's generator outlets, I started monitoring. That habit, the monitoring, became the most important thing I did in those first days. What I heard on the radio in those first 3 days. Panic, mostly. People who'd grabbed radios without knowing how to use them properly, stepping on each other's transmissions, broadcasting on frequencies they thought were private that absolutely weren't, crying, praying. A man who kept repeating his home address over and over in a flat voice for about an hour before his signal went dead. A group of 5 or 6 people who were clearly coordinating in a neighborhood on the north side. They had military-style call procedures, short and efficient, and I listened to them for 2 hours on the second day, trying to figure out if they were an asset or a threat. They sounded organized. They sounded like people with a plan. I never made contact because I didn't know enough yet. The city emergency frequencies went quiet over about 36 hours, patch by patch, district by district. The police channels went first. Fire went intermittent on the afternoon of the 14th and went to nothing by the evening of the 15th. The emergency management frequency, my frequency, the one I'd worked for 11 years, that one held on until about 10 p.m. on the 15th. The last transmission was Kevin Arndt's voice, which I recognized instantly, saying something I couldn't fully hear through the static. What I caught was, "Evacuate to designated," and then either Eastern or the Eastern, and then the signal dropped and didn't come back. Eastern safe zone, Eastern something. I'd heard about the safe zone designations before the 14th. FEMA preparedness documents. In a large-scale disaster scenario, certain pre-identified facilities would be converted to civilian refuge points. The Fairfield site, the agricultural processing complex out east, was one of them. I knew this because we'd had a briefing 18 months earlier about how emergency dispatch would interface with the safe zone intake system. It had seemed very theoretical at the time. It wasn't theoretical anymore. On the morning of the 3rd day, I drove out of the store-all facility, Rook in the passenger seat, the truck loaded with everything I'd gathered, and I went looking for other people. Not because I felt altruistic, because I was smarter than to go alone. Donna Pratt was in a Kroger. I found her because I stopped at the Kroger 2 miles west of the storage facility to do a supply run. The parking lot was empty, except for 4 cars, 3 of them with doors hanging open, one with a figure slumped against the steering wheel that I didn't examine closely. The store's front doors had been forced open, the automatic mechanism dead. Someone had just pried them apart. I went in with the shotgun out and Rook at my left heel. The store was mostly stripped, not entirely. People in a panic go for what they recognize, which means bread and milk and meat, all of which were gone. The canned aisle had been picked over, but not cleaned out. I found about 40 cans worth taking, along with dried pasta, cooking oil, salt in bulk, and a case of instant noodles that someone had knocked off a shelf and not bothered with. I found a camping section near the back that still had most of its stock because nobody thinks about camping supplies when they're in a panic grocery run. I grabbed a portable water filter, fire starters, 2 boxes of heavy-duty zip ties, paracord, and a tarpaulin. I also found Donna Pratt in the pharmacy section, standing behind the counter, methodically going through the prescription storage. She was wearing a Kroger vest, which threw me for a moment. Then I realized she just grabbed it off a peg somewhere because the vest had pockets and she was using them. She turned around when Rook sniffed in her direction, and she looked at us. Me, the truck outside that she could see through the front windows, the shotgun in my hands, and she said, "I'm taking what I need. I'll take what I can carry. I'm not going to fight about it." I said, "I'm not here to fight about it. Are you alone?" She said, "Right now I am." She was 47, she told me later. Former PE teacher at a high school on the north side. Built like someone who'd been active her whole life. Broad shoulders, no wasted movement. She'd been at the store when it started. Had managed to lock herself in the back for 2 days before the infected that had gotten into the store had wandered back out, drawn by something outside. She'd spent those 2 days eating beef jerky from the stockroom and listening to them move through the aisles. She didn't flinch when she talked about it. She said it the way you'd describe a rough commute, a thing that happened that you got through. I asked her if she wanted to come. She said, "Where?" I told her east. She said she needed 5 more minutes to finish going through the pharmacy, and then she'd be ready. She was ready in 4. Pete Holloway was outside a hardware store on the edge of the west side, 3 miles from Kroger. I almost didn't stop. He was on the sidewalk waving at the truck, and my first instinct was to keep moving because the street wasn't clear. 2 of them were working their way along the opposite sidewalk, pushing at a chain-link fence and making that noise, that continuous atonal sound, and stopping felt risky. Rook put his front paws on the dashboard and looked at the man waving. I stopped. Pete was 28, electrician's apprentice, had been on a job site when everything went sideways, and the job site had given him access to a hardware store's delivery bay, where he'd barricaded himself for 2 days. He was pale in the way people get when they haven't eaten properly, and he had a habit of starting sentences and then stopping them, like he'd reconsidered the middle, which made conversations with him slightly exhausting. But he'd put the time in the hardware store to good use. He had bolt cutters, a full set of hand tools, a reciprocating saw with 2 battery packs, wire, electrical tape, a pair of battery-powered lanterns, and 12 8-foot sections of rebar he'd tied in a bundle with wire that he'd been dragging behind him. I said, "What's the rebar for?" He said, For fences, barriers. You can wedge them under a door and they can't push through the door. I tested it. I wedged them, and it holds." He'd spent 2 days in the hardware store testing improvised door barriers against the infected. Not panicking. Problem solving. I told him to put the rebar in the truck bed. Ray Corman was sitting in a recliner in the middle of a residential street. I'm not exaggerating. He'd dragged a lazy boy out of a house and set it up in the street with a footrest deployed, and he was sitting in it eating crackers from a box when we came around the corner. He was 58, retired postal worker, had a bad right knee from a fall off a loading dock 8 years ago that he mentioned within the first 6 minutes of conversation. He'd gotten the recliner from his neighbor's house because his own house had been compromised. He said this with the specific weight of someone who was not going to describe exactly what compromised meant, and he'd decided that if he was going to wait to die, he might as well be comfortable while he waited. He said this cheerfully, with a cracker halfway to his mouth. Donna leaned toward me from the back seat and said quietly, "He's not right." I said, "He's also not wrong." Ray came with us. He didn't bring much. A bag of snacks from the house, a battery radio, a pair of binoculars, and a photo in a frame that he tucked carefully into the side pocket of his bag. He had a folding knife on his belt that he said he'd carried for 20 years and never opened, except to cut twine. His first comment about Rook was that he'd had a Malinois growing up and they were all insane. Rook climbed over the seat and put his nose against Ray's ear, which Ray interpreted as an endorsement. Tasha Morrow found us, which is different from us finding her. We stopped to clear a roadblock, a pair of cars that had been pushed sideways across a lane, and I needed to hook the push bar under one bumper and shove it aside, and she came out of a house 2 doors down. She'd been watching through the window for 20 minutes, she told me later, trying to decide if we were safe. Rook was what decided her. She said, "Dogs don't like bad people. I didn't correct her on this because it seemed to be working in our favor, and I didn't want to explain the nuances of canine behavior assessments. Tasha was 31, former dental hygienist. She had a full medical bag because she'd grabbed it from her clinic, which was 3 blocks from her house, and which she'd gone back to on the second day specifically to get supplies. Antibiotics, enough to matter, suture kit, dental instruments that turned out to be more useful than they sounded for wound care, specifically the irrigation syringes, anti-inflammatories. She was also, unexpectedly, calm in a way that read as professional rather than dissociative. She'd grown up in a rural area, she said. She knew how to do things. She didn't specify what things. Over the next 3 weeks, I found out it included things like setting a dislocated shoulder, purifying creek water with improvised filtration, and driving a tractor. So that was us. Owen Briggs, 42, former emergency dispatcher. Donna Pratt, 47, PE teacher. Pete Holloway, 28, electrician's apprentice. Ray Corman, 58, retired postal worker with a bad knee. Tasha Morrow, 31, dental hygienist who grew up country. And Rook, 4 years old, Belgian Malinois, too much dog for everyone else in the world. We left the city on the evening of the 3rd day. I want to describe the outskirts of Columbus on that evening in September because the specific quality of it stays with me. There is a ring of neighborhoods around any major city where the city starts to become uncertain of itself. Not quite suburbs yet, not city anymore. The houses get farther apart. Chain stores stop and independent businesses appear, and then those stop too. Industrial properties, fencing, dead-end streets that were supposed to become through streets when development continued and never did. That ring, on the evening of day 3, was quiet in a way that cities are not supposed to be quiet. Not the absence of a specific noise. The whole frequency range was just gone. No traffic hum, no HVAC units cycling, no distant music from someone's open window. The things that make up the background sound of human existence. The sounds so constant you stop hearing them until they're gone, were gone. What replaced them was wind, and the occasional sound of an infected somewhere in the middle distance, following the gradient of noise the way water follows the gradient of elevation. Rook sat at perfect attention in the passenger seat, and his ears moved independently, like satellite dishes, tracking things I couldn't hear. We passed a gas station about a mile outside the city proper. Marathon. Blue and white signage. One of the pumps still had its receipt sticking out like someone had just finished fueling. I pulled in. The fuel situation was something I'd been thinking about since the first day. The truck had started full. Emergency vehicles are kept topped up, but I'd been running it more than I should, and I had maybe 3/4 of a tank at this point. Not urgent yet, but the logic of it was simple, and I'd worked it through. Fuel in the ground at any gas station was still fuel. I had a hand pump and hose in the truck bed from the hardware store supply. Siphoning wasn't efficient, but it worked. I backed the truck up to the pump housing, pulled out the hand pump, and with Pete's help, we cracked the access cover on the underground tank. I won't pretend this was quick. It took about 40 minutes to transfer enough fuel to fill the truck, and we had to do it as quietly as 2 people can do something involving a hand pump and metal pipe couplings, which is not very quietly. Donna and Ray stayed in the truck. Tasha kept watch at the corner of the building with the crowbar in both hands. Nothing came. I also went through the store. I want to be clear about this part, because I don't know who might listen to this recording, and I want them to understand the thinking. The store wasn't a smash and grab. I moved systematically. Food that would travel well. Beef jerky, vacuum-sealed nuts, protein bars, the hard candies they always keep near the register in those big glass jars, which turned out to be genuinely useful for keeping energy up during long drives. I found a road atlas under the counter, which sounds useless in the age of smartphones, but was not useless at all, given that most of our phones were now just cameras and flashlights. I found a pair of work gloves still in the packaging, a rain poncho, and a first aid kit mounted on the wall that I took off the wall and added to Tasha's bag. Behind the counter, a wooden bat. Not a weapon, technically. It was leaned there like someone had been using it as a display prop. I took it anyway and put it in the door well on my side. Underneath the register, a gas station manual, like an operating manual for running the station, franchise requirements, inventory checklists. I almost left it. I took it. I read it that night and the next day, because information about fuel storage, tank volumes, and delivery schedules turned out to be genuinely useful information for the next 10 days. From the bathroom, a full roll of paper towels, a full dispenser of hand soap, and a folded emergency poncho in a vending machine packet that someone had left on the back of the tank. Total time inside the store, about 9 minutes. I moved fast. We drove for another hour, before stopping for the night at a farm equipment dealer. A John Deere place, with a large steel building, and a chain on the door that Pete cut in, under 3 minutes. We pulled the truck inside, closed the building doors, and did not run the engine. That night was the first night with the full group, and it had a specific quality to it. 5 strangers in a large, dark building, with a dog who would not sit still, all of us listening to the same sounds and trying to calculate what they meant. Pete fell asleep, sitting up against the truck's rear tire. Ray snored, not loud but consistent, a small sound that was somehow the most normal thing I'd heard in 3 days. Donna ate crackers and wrote in a small notebook that she kept in her vest pocket. Tasha checked everyone's hands and arms by headlamp, methodically, without announcing what she was looking for. I knew what she was looking for. I lay on my back in the truck bed and stared at the metal ceiling and thought about Claire. We were on the road for 11 days before we reached Fairfield. I'm going to describe those 11 days as honestly as I can, which means describing them as a mixture of terrifying, boring, exhausting, and occasionally bizarre, because that's what they were. Day 4. We found a clear stretch of Route 40 heading east, and made good time for about 3 hours before the road became impassable near a town called Kirkersville, not blocked by vehicles, blocked by what had to be 200 or 300 infected, all moving the same direction, a slow tide of them going west toward the city. We sat on a hill about a quarter-mile back and watched them through Ray's binoculars. They weren't running. They weren't organized in any meaningful way. They were just going. Following sound, I thought, the same way they always did. Something in the city was still generating enough noise to pull them toward it. We waited 2 hours for the flow to thin, and then went around through a field road, the truck grinding over the furrows, Pete in the back holding the supplies from sliding around. Day 5. The town of Millbrook. I need to spend some time on Millbrook. Millbrook it's a small town, maybe 1,500 people in normal times. We came through it on the 5th day because the main route was blocked, and Ray's road atlas showed Millbrook had a through road that would save us significant distance. I turned onto the main street at about 2 in the afternoon, and within the first block I knew something was off. It wasn't that it was abandoned. Abandoned had become the normal. Every town we'd been through was abandoned in the way of a place where people left in a hurry. Cars at odd angles, doors open, personal items dropped in the street, all the human mess of an unplanned departure. Millbrook looked different. There were infected in Millbrook, maybe 30 or 40 of them, spread through the downtown area, doing what infected do, walking and bumping and turning toward sounds. But they were not the thing that was wrong. The thing that was wrong was where they were standing. Every single infected in Millbrook's main street, every one of them, was facing one specific building. Not toward each other, not wandering at random, facing one building. It was a hardware store on the east end of the main block, a brick building with a wooden sign, windows dark, door closed. They were just standing there, not moving, not making their noise, just facing that building. I stopped the truck 3 blocks away, and Rook stood up on the seat, and the hair along his spine rose, which I had never seen him do before. Not at any of the infected we'd been near before, just at this. I said, very quietly, "Is everyone seeing this?" Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Donna said, "They're listening to something." I thought about that for a second. Listening. The infected respond to sound. I'd watched them enough by now to understand that basic mechanic. They move toward noise, but they were already at the source. They were standing at the source, and not moving, not making their own noise, just oriented. What was in that hardware store? I turned the truck around very slowly, minimum throttle, in a driveway 3 blocks back. Rook did not sit down until we were back on the road, heading around Millbrook via a different route. He kept looking behind us through the rear window. I don't know what was in that hardware store. I made a rule for myself after Millbrook. When something doesn't fit the pattern, don't investigate. Driving past something you don't understand and continuing to live is a better outcome than understanding it and not. But I think about it still. On nights when I can't sleep, which is most nights now, I think about those 30 or 40 things standing perfectly still in a small town street, all facing the same building, silent. Day 6, fuel stop. I'd been calculating this for 2 days. The truck was down to just under half a tank, at highway speeds on clear roads that would last a while, but we weren't getting highway speeds on clear roads. We were doing stop and start on partially blocked state routes, and the mileage was bad. The answer was farm tanks. This is where the gas station manual from day 3 turned out to be genuinely useful. It had a section on fuel storage regulations that described the types of tanks used by farms and agricultural facilities. Most working farms keep bulk diesel on site, above-ground tanks, usually a few hundred gallons. It's for their equipment. The fuel doesn't get delivered as frequently as gas stations, which means it's often still there when a gas station's tanks have been stripped. We found a farm with a tank on day 6, about 2 miles off the main road. I could see it from the road, white tank on a stand near the barn. We pulled up the dirt drive carefully, Rook sniffing at the window, and I did a visual check of the property before getting out. Nothing moving in the yard. 3 infected in the far field, their backs to us, standing near a fence line. I watched them for 2 minutes. They didn't react to the truck. The tank was about 60% full. Diesel. The truck ran on diesel. I spent 20 minutes transferring fuel through the pump on the tank's side. These farm tanks have a nozzle and a hand pump. It's designed to be pumped into equipment. I topped the truck off and transferred the surplus into 2 5-gallon metal cans we'd found in the John Deere building. So we left with a full tank and 10 gallons in reserve. While I was doing this, Donna went through the farmhouse. She came back with a box of jarred preserves, the homemade kind, a dozen jars of tomatoes and peppers and jam, a bag of dried beans from what must have been a 100-pound sack someone had broken open, a partial bag of cornmeal, and a large bottle of vegetable oil. She also found a pair of winter boots in someone's size that fit Pete, whose shoes had been developing a hole in the left sole. Pete wore them for the rest of the trip. Ray found the farm's medicine cabinet and brought out everything he could read labels on: Tylenol, ibuprofen, allergy meds, blood pressure medication, that we didn't know who it was for, but Tasha kept, because she said it might matter later. We ate well that evening. Donna cooked beans and tomatoes on the camp stove in the lee of the truck, and we ate from the pot with spoons, and it was the first hot meal we'd had in 4 days. Rook got the last of the beef jerky from my pack, and he ate it in 2 bites, and looked at me expecting more. I said, "Buddy, I know." Day 7, the highway. We got on Interstate 70 east of Zanesville, and that's where we found it. Someone had cleared the highway. Not perfectly cleared. There were still vehicles pulled to the sides, still debris, still the occasional abandoned semi with its doors open. But the left lane, the eastbound left lane specifically, had been pushed clear. All the way clear, as far as I could see through the windshield. Every car that had been blocking it had been shoved to the shoulder or the right lane. You could tell because some of the cars were crumpled in specific places. Push bar marks, the same kind of mark my truck could make, and the angles at which they'd been moved told a mechanical story of something going systematically along the lane, pushing obstacles out. This had been done deliberately, by someone with a vehicle equipped for it, and it had been done recently enough that the pushed vehicles weren't yet under the layer of road grit that was starting to accumulate on everything by day 7. I drove in the cleared lane and I looked for whoever had done this. Watched the exits, the overpasses, the rest stops. Nothing. We drove 40 miles of clear left lane before it ended at an overpass, where a tanker truck had jackknifed across all lanes and hadn't been moved. Whoever had been clearing the road had stopped here. The jackknife tanker was too big for whatever they were using. Ray speculated. Government, military, some convoy that went east and cleared as it went. Pete said, if it was military, they would have come back by now. Donna said nothing, which I'd learned meant she'd thought of something she wasn't sure was worth saying. I said, Donna. She said, the left lane specifically, not both lanes. One lane clear, going east. That's a very specific choice. If you're clearing a path for yourself, you clear both lanes so you can move freely. If you're clearing a path for other people to follow, you clear one lane so they know which direction to go. I looked at the clear lane stretching behind us in the mirror for a while. Someone had been leaving a trail. Day 8 brought rain. Real rain, not a drizzle. The kind of September storm that comes in gray and earnest and means business. It hammered the roof of the truck and reduced visibility to about 100 feet and turned the shoulder grass into standing water. The wipers kept up. I drove at 20 miles an hour because anything faster felt reckless, and because on day 8, at mile marker 141, we found the woman. She was standing in the rain in the middle of the road. Not in the cleared lane, in the right lane, in the rain, just standing there. Not moving, not reacting to the truck. My first thought was infected, and I stopped about 60 feet away and watched her. Rook watched her. She was wearing a yellow rain jacket and jeans, and she was looking down at the road surface in front of her feet. Then she looked up. And that was the thing. The infected don't look up at a truck and then look down again. They don't modulate. This was a person. She was just standing in the rain, alone on a highway, looking at the ground. I pulled forward slowly and stopped with the window at her level. She was maybe 40, brown hair plastered to her face. No bags, no supplies that I could see. She had a red smear on the forearm of her jacket that was either paint or not paint, and I was trying to decide which. I said, "Are you hurt?" She looked at me. Her eyes tracked. Clear, not the glazed-over quality of someone feverish or in shock. At least not the kind of shock I recognized. But she didn't speak. I said, "We're going east. Safe zone at Fairfield. Do you want to come?" Nothing. Not a refusal, not a nod. Just looking at me with this expression that I couldn't read. Which is unusual, because I've spent 11 years being paid to read people's emotional states from the sound of their voice alone. I should have been able to read her face. I couldn't. Tasha got out. She walked around in the rain to the woman and spoke to her quietly. And after a moment, the woman let Tasha take her arm and walk her around to the passenger side back door. She got in. She sat in the back seat between Donna and Ray. Rook turned around and looked at her from the front, and then turned back around, which was not his normal response to a new person. He usually nosed them, demanded attention. He just looked and turned away. The woman sat in the back seat for the next 2 hours of driving without speaking. She ate a granola bar that Tasha handed her. She looked out the window. At one point, Ray tried to introduce himself, and she looked at him with that same unreadable expression, and he let it go. Her name was Helen Marsh. Tasha told me this on day 9. She'd found a driver's license in the pocket of the rain jacket when she helped the woman remove it. Columbus address, 41 years old. Helen never told us herself. In the 4 days she was with us, she never spoke. I'll come back to Helen. Day 9. The second fuel stop and the town of Gratiot. We hit Gratiot because the main route had a bridge out. Not dramatically out, not collapsed, just structurally compromised, in the way of a bridge that had been rammed by something very heavy and was now carrying a visible cant to the left that I was not going to test with a truck this weight. So, we went around through Gratiot, which is a crossroad-sized town, a grain elevator and a church, and a diner, and not much else. Gratiot had been looted thoroughly, not messily, thoroughly. Everything useful had been taken from the diner, from the single gas station, from the volunteer firehouse at the north end of town, but done in an organized way. The firehouse, specifically, the equipment bay was empty, both trucks gone. All the gear that had been mounted on the walls was stripped, but the office behind the bay was swept and the doors were properly closed. Someone had been here with a plan and had executed it. I found one thing they'd left, a handwritten note on a clipboard hanging on the office door. It said, "Taken, Engine 1, Engine 2, all turnout gear, medical kits, jaws of life, generator, fuel reserves, going east. If you're reading this, Fairfield is the destination, east on 70. Left lane is clear to mile 141 where the tanker is blocking. You'll need to find another way around after that. God bless." No name, no date. I showed Donna. She said, "The lane clearers." I said, "They came from here, a volunteer fire department." Ray said, from the doorway, "That's a hell of a thing, loading up 2 fire trucks and just going." I thought about Kevin Arndt, the transmission I'd heard. Evacuate to designated Eastern. He'd known about Fairfield. If emergency dispatch knew, then emergency services knew. If emergency services knew and had routes and resources, some of them would have gone. Some of them would have made it. The note changed something for me. Not just the information, the handwriting. Whoever wrote it had taken the time to use neat, legible printing, like they'd thought about the person who would read it, like they cared about that hypothetical person they'd never met. That matters when most of what you've seen for 9 days has been evidence that people stop caring pretty quickly. I took the note off the clipboard and put it in my shirt pocket. We found a way around the tanker on the highway, using a county road, and rejoined Route 70 east of the blockage. The cleared lane had continued, which meant the fire department convoy had come back to clear it further. They'd gone ahead of us. They were going to Fairfield. They were probably already at Fairfield. I drove faster. Day 10. Helen. This is hard to describe without speculating, and I don't want to speculate, so I'm going to stick to what I observed. Helen Marsh had not spoken in 2 days. She ate when food was offered. She slept, or seemed to sleep, sitting up. She used the side of the road for biological necessities without needing prompting or guidance. She was functional in the minimal sense. On the morning of day 10, Tasha woke me up before anyone else was moving and said quietly, "Come look." Helen was sitting in the rear cargo area of the truck, which she'd moved to at some point in the night. She was sitting with her knees drawn up and her head against the side panel, and she was not asleep. Tasha said, "Watch her breathing." I watched. Her breathing was wrong. Not labored, not gasping, just wrong. Too slow and too regular, like a metronome. Humans don't breathe like that when they're sleeping. Even in deep sleep, the rhythm varies. This was just in, beat, out, beat, in, beat, out. Her skin looked fine. No bruising, no discoloration. No fever that Tasha could feel. Eyes not glassy. She didn't react to me looking at her. Tasha said, "I don't know what it is. It might be shock, severe dissociation. I've seen that. But the breathing is..." I said, "Is she bitten?" Tasha was quiet for a moment. She said, "I checked when she was sleeping. I can't find any bite wound. There's a bruise on her left shoulder that might be from a grab, not a bite." I thought about the red smear on her jacket sleeve. I'd assumed paint. It wasn't the color of blood, and it wasn't the color of anything else I'd seen on the road either. It was a specific red, almost orange, like rust mixed with something. I didn't know what to do. We weren't at a point where I could tell someone to leave the truck because I had a bad feeling. She hadn't done anything threatening. She was just wrong in a way that I couldn't put into a category. I said to Tasha, "Watch her. Tell me if anything changes." Tasha nodded. She spent most of day 10 watching Helen. Helen spent most of day 10 looking out the window without expression. That evening, an hour before we reached the Fairfield area, Helen said her first words since we'd found her on the highway. She said, "Don't go there." Not to anyone in particular, not loud. In the flat tone of someone reading a street sign, not a warning. Donna said, "Don't go where, Helen?" Helen said, "They know." And that was it. She didn't say anything else. She went back to looking out the window. Ray and Pete looked at each other. Donna looked at me. I said, "What does that mean, Helen? Can you say more?" She said nothing. I thought, severe trauma, dissociative break. She saw something. Probably something very bad. And she's processing it in the way some people do, by going somewhere inside where it can't reach. The "don't go there" was probably her past, not our present. Some place she'd been that she was reliving in whatever internal loop her mind had gotten stuck in. I kept driving east. I want to tell you now that I believed that. I genuinely believed that at the time. I want to be clear about it because what came later might make it seem like I should have known. I didn't know. She was traumatized. The most rational explanation was always trauma. We reached the Fairfield complex on the evening of day 11, Thursday to Monday, if you're counting. 10 days and change from the 14th. The last 4 miles on the county road leading to the complex were notable. The road had been swept, not perfectly, but the worst of the debris had been moved to the shoulders, and there were reflective markers on stakes at intervals, the bright orange kind used in construction zones, guiding you toward the facility. Someone had done this. Someone inside had put out markers to guide people in, which made what happened next considerably more confusing. The facility was lit up. I need to say that again because it keeps being the thing I come back to. The lights were on. Serious lights. Industrial floodlights mounted on the container walls, lighting up the surrounding area in a pale yellow wash for 300 feet in every direction. The walls were the container stacks, 4 layers high in places, welded together into what looked like solid barrier from the road. At the main entrance, a wide section on the south side that had once been the facility's truck delivery entrance, there was a reinforced gate, not improvised, proper gate. Welded steel plate over the original sliding mechanism, lookout position on top with sandbags, concertina wire across the approach. I stopped the truck on the road about 200 feet from the gate and sat there. The lights were on. The gate was closed. No one was in the lookout position. No one was at the gate. But the cameras, and there were cameras on the gate posts, on the corners of the nearest container walls, proper security cameras, were working. I could see the red indicator lights on them. I could see one of them move. I pulled up to the gate. I turned on the truck's emergency lights. The full array, the ones that are supposed to mean this is an emergency vehicle, come to us, and I held down the truck's air horn for 5 seconds. The sound of it crossed the empty fields and came back as an echo, and then settled into silence. Nothing from the gate. I got on the truck's external speaker, the PA, the one we used for crowd control and evacuation announcements, and I said, "This is Owen Briggs, Emergency Dispatch, Columbus Communications Center. I have 5 civilians and requesting entry. Please respond." A camera on the left gate post moved. It turned and pointed directly at me. Nobody came. That was an hour and 12 minutes ago. Now it's 11:43, and I've tried the PA 4 times, and I've driven the perimeter once, and I'm back in the original position, 200 feet from the gate, with the truck idling and Rook's chin on the armrest, and the others quiet in the back. I need to figure out what's happening inside. And to do that, I'm going to use the one advantage I have over every other person sitting in a truck outside this gate tonight. I know how emergency communications work. The Fairfield complex was a federally designated emergency refuge, which means it should have had, if any of the preparedness infrastructure held, a designated emergency communications setup. The FEMA preparedness documentation I'd seen 18 months ago referenced interoperability channels, frequencies that civilian and military and government emergency systems all shared. You couldn't use them for regular communication. They were reserved, monitored, technically restricted, but they existed specifically so that in an emergency, different agencies could talk to each other. Emergency dispatch ran off one of those channels. My console at the communications center had a secondary bank of frequencies, including 2 FEMA interoperability channels. I knew those frequencies by heart because I'd had to input them manually 6 times during the system's last maintenance cycle, and the repetition had burned them into me. The truck's radio rig could reach those frequencies. I told Donna what I was going to do. She said, "Will they be able to hear you broadcast?" I said, "Yes, and that's the point. If they can hear me on an interoperability channel, then I know someone in there is monitoring emergency communications. And if they're monitoring, They know I'm out here, and they're choosing silence. That tells me something. I opened the radio console. I dialed in the first interoperability frequency. I keyed the mic and I said, "Fairfield Refuge. This is Unit 7, Columbus Emergency Communications, monitoring on interop primary. I have survivors requesting entry. Please respond." And I heard something. Not a response to me. I heard a voice, mid-sentence, cut off when I transmitted. Because my transmission stepped on theirs. I caught maybe 4 words. "Cannot risk another." And then it was gone. They were talking on the interop channel. They were using the channel I was monitoring. I waited. 30 seconds. Keyed again. "Fairfield Refuge, Unit 7. I just heard you on this frequency. I know you're monitoring. Please respond." Silence. Then, very low, almost below what the radio could pick up, a different voice. Not directed at me, directed at someone in the room on the other side. But my radio was on, and the person transmitting didn't know that, or didn't care. The voice said, "How many outside now?" Another voice, same low quality, 6. 1 vehicle, emergency truck, Columbus markings. First voice, and the others, the ones from before. Second voice, still there. They're not going anywhere. The transmission ended. I pulled the truck around to where I could see more of the perimeter. I used the roof spotlight to sweep the fence line to the north of the main gate, and I found what I was looking for on the second sweep. 2 more vehicles, parked against the fence on the north face. Not emergency vehicles. A pickup truck, and what looked like a large SUV, both of them dark, no lights. The SUV had its side door slid open. I could see shapes inside. More survivors. They'd been here before us. I got out of the truck. I know that sounds like a decision I should have thought about longer. It was 11:57 at night. There were infected in the surrounding area. We'd counted 9 on the approach road, and there were almost certainly more in the fields. And getting out of the truck exposed me to all of that. But I needed to talk to whoever was in those vehicles, and I couldn't do it through a window. I took the shotgun. I told Donna, "If you hear anything that sounds wrong, get the truck running." Rook stayed in the truck, which he protested vocally for about 15 seconds, before Donna convinced him to lie down. I walked the perimeter to the north. I stayed close to the container wall, close enough that anything in the dark approaching from the field side would have to pass me before reaching the wall, and the floodlights made that area reasonably bright. The wall gave me partial cover. The infected in the area were responding to the PA broadcasts I'd done earlier. I could see 3 of them in the field on the south side, working their way toward where the sound had come from. I moved north, opposite direction. The pickup and the SUV. I approached from the side with the light, slowly, hands visible where I could manage it, while still holding the shotgun. I got within 20 feet and stopped. A man leaned out of the pickup window. He had a rifle, half raised, pointed somewhere in my direction, without quite pointing at me. I said, "I'm not infected. I have a truck on the south side. I'm the one who was on the PA." He said, "I heard." I said, "How long have you been here?" He said, "Since about 6 this evening." That was 5 hours before us. His name was Douglas Kraft. He was 54, former Army logistics officer turned building contractor. He spoke in the clipped economical way of someone who'd been trained to communicate precisely and hadn't lost the habit. He had 5 people in the 2 vehicles, including a woman who was badly hurt, a leg wound from something that had happened 2 days before reaching Fairfield, he said, which is when I realized they'd been traveling longer than us and from farther away. He said, "Your PA was a waste of time. They heard us when we arrived. They opened the intercom on the gate, the speaker system, and told us to wait. Said they were processing. Said someone would come to the gate to evaluate." I said, "And?" He said, "Nobody came." 3 hours after that, someone on the gate speaker said intake was suspended. Facility at capacity. No further entry. I said, "Capacity." He said, "That's what they said." I said, "This facility is a working agricultural processing complex. It has industrial warehouse space, multiple large buildings, a loading yard. The capacity for a food processing facility is not, he said. I know, the way he said it. Not frustrated, not confused, just, I know, like he'd already moved past the stated reason to what the reason meant. I said, what do you think is actually happening? He was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the main gate, which was visible from where we stood, 200 meters away, lit up, locked, cameras tracking. He said, there was a woman. She came out of the field on the east side about 2 hours ago, on foot, alone, coming from the direction of the facility's secondary entrance, the one on the east side that's not the main gate, more of a service access, not as well reinforced. She was moving fast. Not running, just moving, like someone with a purpose. She stopped when she saw our vehicles. She looked like she'd been inside. I said, did you talk to her? He said, for about 3 minutes. She was scared to be outside the perimeter. She wouldn't tell me her name. She said, and I want to be precise about this because I've been thinking about it for 2 hours, she said. They stopped letting people in because of the tests, she said. They've been testing everyone for the V strain, and the ones who come back flagged aren't being kept in a holding area, she said. They're not in a holding area. I said, where are they? Douglas Kraft looked at me. He said, she didn't finish the sentence. She heard something inside, some sound from the east side of the facility, and she turned around and went back through the service access, and I haven't seen her since. I stood there in the dark outside the floodlight zone, thinking about what a V-strain test was, and what it would mean to fail one, and what she had meant by, they're not in a holding area. I went back to the truck. I told Donna and the others what Douglas had said. Pete went pale in the way he did when things got worse, which was a very particular, very Pete color, a grayish thing under his normal complexion that turned him into a walking anxiety indicator. Ray said, well, that doesn't sound good. Tasha said nothing, which was more alarming than Pete going gray. I got on the radio. I went back to the interrupt frequency and I just listened, not transmitting, just monitoring. For about 20 minutes there was nothing. Then voices again, same two, the ones from before. And this time they weren't careful. First voice, we've got 2 more dead out in the east quarter. That's 17 total. Second voice, same time frame? First voice, between 4 and 6 hours after flagging. Consistent with what the doc said, the slow strain average is 6 hours from secondary symptom onset to turn. Second voice, what about the ones from the second intake wave? Harlan cleared them personally. First voice, Harlan said they looked clean, and they were. But the ones from the highway group? Second voice, the highway group flagged at 30%. 30%, Marcus. First voice, I know. Second voice, do you understand what 30% means if we'd let them all in? Do you understand? First voice, I said I know. A pause, a long one. Second voice, the gate stays closed. That's final. Harlan's decision. First voice, what about the ones outside right now? Second voice, what about them? First voice, there are children in one of those vehicles. Douglas's group has 2 kids. Second voice, then they should have gotten here yesterday. That's not. The transmission cut. I sat there with the handset in my fist. 30%. Slow strain, V strain. Something in the blood that they were testing for. Something that turned you, not immediately, but on a delay. 6 hours on average. And when a group of highway survivors had been tested, 30% had come back positive. So they'd close the gate, because if they let 30% of every incoming group pass the walls, eventually the inside of the facility became what the outside was. I could follow that logic. I could follow it, and I could even, in a cold, analytical way, understand why someone would make that choice. The math was brutal. If 100 people arrived and you let them in, and 30 of them were ticking, 6 hours, no symptoms, completely normal looking, you'd find out in the worst possible way. But the other thing in that transmission, the 17 dead in the East Quarter, that wasn't people who'd turned after being tested and found positive. People who tested positive wouldn't be in the east quarter of the facility, mixing with everyone else. They'd be in a holding area. Unless they weren't in a holding area. Unless the woman Douglas had spoken to was right. That they weren't in a holding area. 17 dead. In the east quarter. Between 4 and 6 hours after flagging. I needed to think about what 17 dead people between 4 and 6 hours after flagging meant if they were not in a holding area. My hands were on the steering wheel. I noticed they were pressing very hard against the wheel. I made myself let go. I said, "Tasha." She said, "Yeah." I said, "Tell me what you know about a slow strain infection." Something called the V strain. Something that doesn't turn you right away. That has a delay. She was quiet for longer than I wanted. She said, "There were reports in the first 48 hours. Some patients at the hospitals, the ones who'd been bitten but weren't turning. Normal presentation of wound infection, fever, standard response. But then 6-8 hours later, not all of them, some of them, a subset." I said, "Tested positive for something." She said, "I didn't see testing in practice. We didn't have time for testing. But there were references in the early emergency medical bulletins. I was checking the emergency feeds on my phone in the first hours, to a secondary incubation profile. Slower, much slower than the primary." I said, "And what's the difference between someone who tests positive and someone who actually turns?" She said, "I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I don't know if everyone who tests positive turns. I don't know if some people carry it and fight it off. The primary strain is aggressive. Everyone bit by the primary turns. The secondary might not be the same." I said, "Or it might." She said, "Or it might." I thought about that for a while. Then I thought about Claire. Claire, who was trying to get out of the short north. Claire, who would have done the smart thing and gotten out early, because she was always the smarter one. Claire, who would have followed the evacuation routes, would have gone east, would have found the cleared left lane. Claire, who might have arrived at Fairfield in one of those highway groups. The highway groups. 30% flagged. I said, out loud, not to anyone, "What happens to the ones who flag positive? The ones who flag and don't turn in 6 hours?" Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer. Because the only people who had the answer were on the other side of the gate. And the woman Douglas spoke to had stopped her sentence before finishing it. I'm going to describe Colonel Victor Harlan as I came to understand him over the next several hours, through the transmissions I monitored. He was a former National Guard logistics officer who had, through some combination of being at the right place at the right time and having the right kind of personality for a crisis, ended up running the Fairfield facility. He was not a bad person in the way that people you want to call villains are bad. He was a person who had looked at an impossible situation and chosen survival at a scale that required him to make choices he would not have made in any other context. The facility held, by my estimation from the radio traffic, about 400 people. 400 survivors in a space designed for agricultural processing. Technically feasible, deeply uncomfortable, but alive. They had food. The facility was a processing complex and had bulk stores. They had water from a well that the facility's industrial setup already drew from. They had the fire trucks from Gratiot, which I heard referenced in passing. The volunteer department had made it, had arrived with their engines, which gave them firefighting capacity and a generator. They had medical staff, some nurses, one doctor who had apparently been traveling with a group from Zanesville. 400 people, alive, inside a facility that was working. And now they had a test. The doctor, a man named Ellison, referenced on the radio, had developed some kind of rapid assessment. Not a blood test in the clinical sense. They didn't have laboratory equipment. Something behavioral and physiological. Pupil response, blood pressure pattern, something observable. It wasn't perfect. Harlan himself acknowledged this in a transmission I caught around 1 o'clock a.m. He said, "The doc's protocol is about 85% accurate, which means 15% false positives or 15% false negatives, and I'd rather have false positives on the outside than false negatives on the inside." False positives. People who test positive, who aren't actually infected. who will never turn, who are being kept outside the gate, or being dealt with in some other way, because the test said they might turn. 15% false positive rate on a test with an 85% accuracy. I did the math. If the highway group had a 30% flag rate, and 15% of those were false positives, that's roughly 4 to 5 people out of every 100 who tested positive who were actually fine, not carrying the slow strain, just flagging on an imperfect test, getting treated as if they were ticking clocks. 17 dead in the East Quarter. I needed to know what that meant, and I needed to know if Claire was one of the highway arrivals, and I needed to know if Claire had been tested and what happened to her if she had. At 1:17 a.m., I made a decision. I walked back to Douglas Craft. I said, I need to get inside, not through the main gate, through the east service access the woman used. He said, what's in there? I said, my sister, and a very bad situation that I think you need to know about. I told him what I'd heard on the radio, all of it. I was precise, because I thought he deserved precision. He stood in the dark outside his pickup truck and listened without interrupting, which is the sign of someone who is comfortable with difficult information. When I finished, he said, the 17. I said, yeah. He was quiet. Then, you think they're not turning. You think some of them are fine. I said, I think some of them were never going to turn. I think some of them flagged on a bad test and got treated like they were infected. He said, by treated you mean? I said, I don't know exactly, but not a holding area. She said, not a holding area. The woman in Douglas's SUV, the badly injured one, her name was Patrice. She called to him from inside the vehicle. He went to her for a moment, came back. He said, Patrice says she remembers seeing an announcement on a radio transmission before she lost her phone signal. She remembers it said Fairfield was operational. Fairfield was accepting survivors. People followed that announcement here, from as far as Cincinnati, she thinks. The highway group might have been 200 people. 200 people, 30% flagging. 60 people. Ellison's test, 85% accurate. On 60 people, that's 9 false positives. 9 people being treated as infected who are not. I said, I'm going to the east access, the service gate. I want you to stay here with your people. If I make contact inside, if I can find out what's happening, I'll try to get the gate open, main gate or service gate, I'll try. He said, what do you want me to do? I said, in 30 minutes, I want you to go on the PA of one of your vehicles and start broadcasting. Not loud, directed at the gate. Keep them focused on the south and north sides. He said, you want a distraction. I said, I want their eyes on you. He said, and if something comes out of the field at us while we're broadcasting? I said, then you stop and deal with it. I'm sorry, I don't have a better idea. He said, 30 minutes. I went back to the truck. I told Donna everything I'd told Douglas. Then I said, I'm going to try the east access. I need the bolt cutters, and I need the headlamp. I'm leaving the shotgun with you. Donna said, that's not smart. I said, the shotgun's loud, and I'm trying not to be. I'm taking the bat and the crowbar. She said, Owen. I stopped. She said, if your sister flagged their test. I said, I know. She said, you know that doesn't mean she's... I said, Donna, I know. I'm going anyway. She handed me the bolt cutters without another word. I said to Rook, stay. He looked at me. I said, stay, bud. Guard them. He lay down on the seat. He put his chin on the dashboard and he watched me go. That was the hardest part of leaving the truck, if I'm honest. Harder than the dark, harder than the possibility of infected in the field. Harder than not knowing what I was walking into. Leaving Rook watching me through the windshield. The east service access was about 400 meters from the main gate along the perimeter wall. The container stacks weren't as high on this side. 3 layers instead of 4, and the gate was smaller. A standard industrial sliding gate. Chain link with a steel frame. The kind you'd use to bring supply vehicles into a processing yard. It had been padlocked from the inside, which I could see when I got close enough for my headlamp to reach it. Inside the perimeter on this side, there was a gap between the container wall and what looked like a metal equipment shed, about 8 feet of space. The floodlights didn't quite reach this side. They were aimed outward from the main walls, and the east access was in a partial shadow. Not dark, but not fully lit. I looked at the padlock. Standard case-hardened lock on a chain. The bolt cutters would get through the chain if I could get to it, but from the outside, the chain was running through the gate latch and the gate post on the inside. I couldn't get the bolt cutter jaws to where I needed them. I walked along the fence for about 30 feet and looked for what I knew was there somewhere. A gap, a worn section. Any structure that's been erected quickly, under pressure, by people who are not professional fortification builders, will have imperfections. Not failures, just imperfections. A section where the fence meets container join isn't quite flush. A shipping container that sits half an inch higher than its neighbor, creating a gap at the bottom. I found it at the second container joint. The containers were welded together, but not to the ground. They were sitting on a poured concrete pad, and the junction between the pad and the container base was not quite right. One container had settled slightly, creating a gap at the bottom of maybe 4 inches. Not enough to squeeze through, but enough to work with. Over 15 minutes of quiet work with the crowbar, leveraging against the concrete and the container base, the gap became 6 inches, then 8. The container was heavy, and the movement was tiny, but it was movement. At about 9 or 10 inches, I had enough to get the crowbar fully in and use a different angle, prying from below. 12 inches, 14. At 14 inches, I could get my shoulders through if I went sideways. I was not a small person. This was going to be uncomfortable. I went through sideways with the bolt cutters and the crowbar, and I scraped the right side of my ribs on the concrete edge, and I was through. Inside, the east quarter of the Fairfield facility was an equipment storage yard. Forklifts, trailers, agricultural machinery sitting in rows. Between me and the main buildings, about 150 meters. Lights were on in the buildings, movement behind windows. And here is where I encountered the first real thing inside this facility that nobody in the radio transmissions had mentioned. The equipment yard wasn't empty. There were people in the equipment yard. I want to be precise about this. They were alive. They were not infected. At least, they did not present as infected. They were sitting or lying against the equipment and against the fence on the interior east side. Maybe 20 of them, in the half-dark between the equipment shed and the back fence. Several had blankets. Most didn't. Some were sleeping. Some were awake and staring. They were not in a holding area. They were in the equipment yard, in the open, at 2 in the morning in mid-September. Nobody had done anything to them. That was, I need to be specific about this, that was the first thing I checked, looking at them through the dark. Nobody had harmed them, but nobody had given them shelter, or enough blankets or, from what I could see, anything beyond minimal food. They had been set apart. The flagged ones. I moved along the inner fence. I was in shadow from the equipment shed, and the people in the yard hadn't noticed me yet. I was looking for someone specific, which meant I was looking at faces, which meant I was getting close enough to see faces by headlamp, which was risky, but I couldn't do this any other way. I worked through the yard slowly. 15 faces I didn't know. A man who was awake and tracked my movement but didn't speak, just watched me, with an expression of someone who had stopped expecting things. A woman with a child, maybe 7 years old. The child asleep, head in the woman's lap. An older man in what used to be a button-down shirt, now torn, who was staring at the ground in front of him, with his hands folded like he was in church. On the far side of the yard, half behind the wheel of a parked forklift, Claire. I cannot describe what I felt when I saw her. I'm going to skip that part. It's mine, and it's not useful to the recording. She was awake. She was cold. The night was 45 degrees at least, but she was awake. And when I put the headlamp on her face, she flinched from the light, and then focused, and then said my name. Just, Owen. Like she was checking if I was real. I said, "Yeah, it's me." She stood up. She stood up fast. The way you do when something's been taken from you for a long time and then given back. I crossed the distance and I held on to my sister for maybe 30 seconds, and then I pulled back because I needed to see her and I needed to ask her things. I said, "Are you okay? What happened?" She said, "They tested us when we arrived." "A doctor. Some kind of test with your eyes and blood pressure or something. And some of us," I flagged. "Owen, I don't feel wrong. I don't feel infected. I feel cold and scared. But I don't feel like I would know, wouldn't I? I would feel something." I said, "How long ago did you arrive?" She said, "Yesterday morning." So, I was counting. Yesterday morning. It was now past 2 in the morning. That was over 15 hours. I said, "And you're still here?" "You haven't," she said. "Nothing has happened to me. But some of the others, there were more of us in the beginning. Some of them got sick. Some of them actually turned and people inside came and I don't know what happened to them. They were taken out of the yard. But the ones who turned, they did turn, Owen. I watched it happen to a man 3 meters from me. He went from perfectly normal to, in about an hour. It was fast when it started." I said, "But you didn't." She said, "I didn't. It's been 15 hours. I said, "Tasha, the woman in my group, she thinks some people carry the test marker without being infected. Some people flag the test who aren't going to turn." She said, "Then why aren't they letting us back inside? We've been out here. Owen, it's been 15 hours. If I was going to turn, I would have." The ones who turned, they went in under 6 hours. Every one of them. So the ones of us who are still sitting here after 6 hours, after 8, after 15. I said, "They know." She said, "They know?" I said, "They know. I've been listening to their radio. They know the 6-hour window. They know if you're still yourself at 6 hours, you're probably going to stay yourself." She grabbed my arm. She said, "Then why are we still out here?" I didn't say anything for a moment. Because the math of it, when you played it through, suggested something about Harlan and his team that I didn't want to put into words in front of my sister in a dark equipment yard at 2 in the morning. The answer was, because letting you back inside proves they made a mistake. Letting you back inside means admitting that the test flagged people who weren't infected. And admitting that means confronting what happened to the ones who were flagged. And then, what? What happened to them when they weren't kept in a holding area and they weren't let back in, and they were just in the equipment yard, and they went through the 6 hours, and they were fine, but they were already outside. Some of the 20 people in the yard had been here longer than Claire. I could tell by looking at them. Some of them had been here long enough that they were no longer expecting rescue. I said, "How many of you are here?" She looked around the yard. She said, "There were 31 when they brought us out here. 12 turned and were removed, so 19 now, plus me. 20. I counted. I'd counted 20. 19 who'd flagged and not turned. 19 who'd been outside the buildings in a cold equipment yard for over 6 hours each, some of them much longer, which meant they were almost certainly not infected. One person, Claire, who arrived after most of them and had been here 15 hours. I thought about the door. The door from the equipment yard to the main building. It was on the north wall of the yard, visible from where I was standing. Steel door, heavy, the kind you'd have on an industrial building. I said to Claire, "Is that door locked?" She said, "They lock it at night. During the day. I think it was open during the day. I think." I said, "Is there a guard?" She said, "Sometimes. A man with a rifle who comes out and checks on us. He brought water once." I said, "When?" She said, 3 hours ago." I said, "Okay. I'm going to go back through the fence the way I came. I have people outside. I'm going to bring them around to the service gate, and we're going to open the gate from the inside." She said, "And then what? Just bring everyone through the gate and—" I said, "And then we're going to have a conversation with Harlan." She said, "Who's Harlan?" I said, "The man running this facility, who has been making decisions. I'm going to ask him to explain." She said, "Owen, they have guns, the people inside." I said, I know. She said, you're going to walk in there and… I said, I'm not going to do anything except talk, and I'm going to do it at a volume that 400 people can hear. That's the plan. She said, you don't know what they'll do. I said, I know what the alternative is. Leave you in a yard in September with no blanket and no shelter until someone inside decides they've waited long enough. She was quiet. I said, stay near the east fence. When I come back, I'll be at the service gate. Give me 45 minutes. Getting out through the gap was easier than getting in. I was still scraped up from the entry, and one of the container edges caught my shoulder on the way out, tearing the jacket, but I was through in under 2 minutes. I went back to the truck at a pace that I would generously describe as controlled running. The field was dark, and I ran with the headlamp off because light in a dark field is a sound problem. You'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, how much noise people make when they're running from something they're imagining. I kept my breathing even, dispatcher training again, controlled breathing, one thing at a time. I got back to the truck, opened the door quietly, and Rook came off the seat and hit me in the chest with both front paws before I could stop him. He made a sound that wasn't a bark, lower than a bark, a sort of groaning vocalization, and he stood up against me with his paws on my chest, and I grabbed both of his ears and said, I know, buddy, I know. Donna said, well? I said, she's inside. She's in the equipment yard with 19 other people who flagged the test and didn't turn. I need everyone out. Bringing the group from the south side around to the east, access without attracting the infected, was a logistical problem I spent about 2 minutes solving. The answer was the truck. We drove the perimeter. Slow and dark. No lights. The infected that had been clustering near the south side from the PA broadcasts were drawn to that location, not to a quietly moving vehicle going the other direction. Douglas Kraft followed with his 2 vehicles. Ray said, from the back seat, that this was the worst military operation he'd ever been involved in, and then clarified that he'd never been in the military, but he stood by the assessment. At the east service gate, with Douglas covering from his truck with the rifle aimed at the field, and Pete and I at the gate with the bolt cutters, I cut the chain in about 45 seconds. The gate slid open on its track. It wasn't bolted, just chained, and once the chain was cut, it moved freely. We brought everyone through, Donna first with Rook on a short lead, then Ray, limping but making it, then Tasha. From Douglas's vehicles, 5 people, including the woman with the injured leg, Patrice, who Douglas and another man carried between them, and 2 children, both of them awake and silent in the way children get when they've been frightened for a long time, and have stopped expecting things to stop being frightening. Helen Marsh walked through the gate last. She hadn't said anything since her words in the truck. Don't go there. They know. And she didn't say anything now. She walked through the gate and stopped and looked at the equipment yard. She was in the yard. Before I could process this, she was walking toward the east side of the yard where the survivors were sitting, moving with a purpose that none of her previous behavior had suggested. She walked up to a man sitting against the far fence, a man in his 50s, bald, with a thermal shirt, and she put her hand on his face, and he grabbed her hand and held it. She knew someone in here. I filed that away. Claire had gathered the others in the yard near the service gate when I came in. 19 people in various states of cold and exhaustion, and fragile something, not quite hope, because hope requires a baseline of trust that they'd had stripped from them in the last however many hours. More like, a door has opened, and we are not going to refuse to walk through it. I told them who I was and what I knew. I told them about the test and the 6-hour window and the radio transmissions I'd monitored. I told them what I intended to do about it. A woman near the back of the group said, "What if Harlan's people shoot at us?" I said, "They won't. Not if we do this correctly." She said, "How can you be sure?" I said, "Because 400 people are asleep in there, and whatever Harlan has been doing, he's been doing it quietly and away from them. If 400 people wake up to the sound of gunfire in their facility, Harlan has a much bigger problem than a group of people who just walked in through the service gate." Donna said, from behind me, "That's actually a very good point." I said, We go through the main yard. We go to the main building. We go in, and we make noise. Not hostile noise, just present. We're here. We exist. Look at us. That's the argument. The man Helen had found, her father, it turned out, or some version of father figure, I learned later, said, "And if the test finds some of us who really are infected and just haven't turned yet?" I said, "The test's window is 6 hours. Everyone here has been outside longer than 6 hours. If you haven't turned by now, Ellison's own protocol says you're clear." He said, "Ellison might not agree." I said, "Then Ellison can explain to 400 people why he's holding 19 demonstrably uninfected survivors in an equipment yard at 2 in the morning." The main building door was, as Claire had thought, unlocked during the night rotation between guards. There was a guard, one, as she'd said, who came by every few hours. We waited for the window between checks, which Claire estimated at about 3 hours between the last visit and the next. We had maybe an hour. We went through the door into the main building in a group. 19 survivors from the yard, plus my 7, plus Douglas's 6. 32 people moving through an industrial corridor. The lights were on, emergency lighting, the kind that stays on at a low level, casting everything in an amber-tinged dim that made the space look like the inside of a very large aquarium. The building interior was, I want to describe this because it surprised me. It was organized. Not military organized, not institutionally organized, but the accumulated organization of 400 people who had been living in a space for some period of time and had done what humans do, which is make it livable. There were sleeping areas marked off with hung tarps, a kitchen section around the facility's existing industrial cooking equipment with organized supplies on shelves, a medical area in what had been a break room, curtained off. People were sleeping. 300 and some people asleep in the amber light, in sleeping bags and on cots, and on improvised pallets of cardboard and folded tarps. Children, old people, a man in a wheelchair that someone had duct-taped a pillow to. This is what I was asking Harlan to put at risk by letting 19 test-positive people inside. I understood it. I want to say that clearly, I understood it. 400 people who were alive because someone made hard calls. 400 people who were warm and fed and protected, and the thing protecting them was not being compromised from inside. I understood the math. I also understood the 19 people walking behind me who had spent the night in a cold equipment yard because they'd flagged a test that had a 15% false positive rate. Both things were true. Welcome to the end of the world. Harlan's command post was in the facility manager's office on the second floor. I knew this because the radio transmissions had referenced the office twice. I found the stairs. I climbed them. I knocked. A voice said, "Who is it?" I said, "Owen Briggs, Columbus Emergency Dispatch. I'd like to talk." A long pause, then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. Victor Harlan was shorter than I expected, which is always a strange thing to notice, but I always notice it. He was 50-something, compact, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for most of its life, weathered in the specific way of someone who'd spent years in the field rather than at a desk. He looked at me, looked past me at the group in the corridor, looked back at me. He said, "You came through the east access." I said, "Yes." He said, "You brought them in." I said, "I brought them in." He said, "Do you understand what you might have done?" I said, "I understand what you have been doing, and I'd like to talk about that, but not up here, downstairs, with everyone." He said, "I'm not going to." I said, "Colonel Harlan, there are 32 people behind me in this corridor who have been outside this building, most of them, for more than 6 hours. Your own medical officer's protocol says the 6-hour threshold is the line between infected and non-infected. These people are past that threshold. Your test had a 15% false positive rate, and you've been using it as a final determination. And I don't think you've told 400 people asleep downstairs that that's what you've been doing." He looked at me for a long time. The man from the radio, the second voice, the one who'd been speaking with Harlan, appeared at Harlan's shoulder. He was younger, 30s, had the alert look of someone who'd been awake all night, which he had. His hand went toward a rifle that was leaning against the doorframe. I said, "Don't." Not threatening, not aggressive. Just don't. The way you say it to someone who's about to make a decision they can't take back. His hand stopped. I said, "All I'm asking you to do is come downstairs and talk. In front of everyone. Open. That's it. No one's been hurt. Nothing's happened that can't be explained. But it has to be explained." Harlan looked at the man with the rifle. Harlan looked back at me. He said, "The doctor's protocol." I said, "Your doctor's protocol cleared these people 6 hours ago. You've been keeping them outside because letting them back in means admitting the protocol wasn't perfect. I understand why. But we're going to talk about it downstairs." A pause. A long one. He said, "Some of them turned. People in that yard turned." I said, "Yes. And some of them didn't. And you know which is which. And the ones who didn't are standing behind me. And they've been outside in September at 2 in the morning with no shelter. And I think 400 people deserve to know that's what's been happening in their facility." Something happened in Harlan's face. Not a collapse, not a dramatic crumpling of authority. More like a tiredness coming through. A tremendous, accumulated tiredness. He had probably not slept in longer than I had. He was carrying something that was going to be very heavy to put down. He said, "How many?" I said, 19. "From the yard, plus the people I came with," he said. "And they're all past the 6-hour threshold." I said, "Some of them are past 15 hours. My sister is past 15 hours. He looked at me. He said, "Your sister is one of the flagged group." I said, "She arrived yesterday morning. It's past 2 in the morning now." He closed his eyes, just for a moment. Then he opened them, and he said to the man with the rifle, "Put that down, Marcus." Marcus put the rifle down. Harlan said, "Let me put my boots on." What happened in the main hall of the Fairfield Agricultural Processing Complex at approximately 2:30 in the morning of the day after we arrived is something I don't have a clean way to describe. Not because it was violent. It wasn't. Not because it was triumphant. It wasn't that either. People woke up. That's what happened. Not all of them, not right away, but the sounds of 32 people moving through the space. And then Harlan's voice in the space woke enough of them that by the time Harlan began speaking, there were maybe 200 people standing, or sitting, and paying attention. Harlan talked. He explained the test. He explained the 6-hour threshold. He explained that the facility had made the decision to exclude those who flagged the test, and that he had been monitoring those in the equipment yard, and that he had, and here is where his voice did something, a slight roughening that he controlled quickly, that he had not brought back those who passed the threshold because he had not been certain the threshold was reliable enough to stake 400 lives on. A woman in the crowd said, "How many are in the yard?" Harlan said, 19. She said, "And they're all still fine." He said, "By the protocol's own standard, yes." She said, "Then why are they in the yard?" He didn't answer right away. And in the space of that non-answer, something shifted in the room. Not hostility, more like an adjustment. The kind of thing that happens when 400 people simultaneously recalibrate their understanding of who is making decisions on their behalf, and on what basis. The doctor, Ellison, a small man with glasses and an expression of chronic exhaustion, made his way to the front. He said, "The test is imperfect. I've known it's imperfect. But imperfect information in a..." A man from the crowd said, "How many people died in the yard?" Ellison stopped. The man said, "I heard sounds from the east quarter earlier, last night. How many people died in the yard?" Ellison said, 12 people in the yard turned and were managed. The word managed settled over the room in an uncomfortable way. The same man said, "Managed how?" Harlan said, "Humanely." The word humanely also settled in an uncomfortable way. Douglas Kraft, who had come in with the rest of us and was standing near the back of the room, said in his flat logistics officer voice, "I want to make sure I understand the situation. 12 people in the yard turned and were put down. 19 people in the yard did not turn and were not brought back inside. Those 19 people have been in a cold equipment yard for between 6 and 20 hours at this point. Harlan said, "That's accurate." Douglas said, "And the plan was?" Harlan didn't answer. Douglas said, "Was there a plan?" Harlan said, "We were monitoring. We were making an assessment." I said, and I said it from across the room, not aggressively, just clearly, the same tone I used for 11 years on a dispatch console. "Colonel Harlan, the plan was to not have to decide. The plan was to let the situation resolve itself, because if they turned, problem solved. And if they didn't turn, you were going to have to let them back in and admit that the test was wrong about some of them, and you didn't want to do either." Silence. He said, "That's not." I said, "Is that not accurate?" A longer silence. He said, "It's more complicated than that." I said, "I believe you. I believe it is more complicated than that. I believe you were trying to protect 400 people and the weight of that is real. And the decisions you've made got those 400 people here alive. I believe that." He looked at me. I said, "But the people in the yard are also real, and they're also here, and they're going to need shelter and food, and the same chance you gave everyone else. That's all. That's the whole ask." The woman who had asked about the yard said, from the crowd, "Bring them in. It's done. Bring them in." Not a chant, not a movement, just a statement of the obvious, from someone who had been listening and had made up her mind. A few people around her said the same thing, quietly, not a roar, just a steady, accumulated yes, said in the voices of people who were tired and scared, and had enough left in them to be decent. They brought the 19 in. Ellison re-examined each of them, not with the test. He didn't do the test again. He did a full physical assessment, the kind that takes 5 minutes per person, and involves temperature, and pulse, and visual tracking, and a series of questions. Of the 19, 18 passed without qualification. 1, the man Helen Marsh had embraced in the yard, her father or something close, had a fever that Ellison said was consistent with wound infection, not the V strain. They gave him antibiotics from the facility's medical stores. Claire sat in the main hall with a thermal blanket and a bowl of soup that someone had heated, and she ate the soup without stopping, and then she looked up at me and she said, "I can't believe you're here." I said, "I drove the whole way in an armored truck I stole from the city." She said, "Of course you did." Rook came over and put his nose on her knee, and she scratched his ears for a long time. I'm going to describe what the next 3 days were like, because the situation didn't end with Harlan's admission in the main hall. That was a beginning, not an ending. Harlan didn't step down. Nobody asked him to. The facility needed someone with logistics experience who knew the supply situation and the security protocols and the operational patterns, and removing him would have created a vacuum at the worst possible time. What changed was accountability. People started attending the daily briefings that Harlan had apparently been running for his inner circle. Not 400 people. It wasn't that organized. But representatives, a loose council of maybe 15 people, drawn from the different groups that had arrived at different times. Douglas Kraft became one of them. I became one of them, which I did not particularly want but accepted, because I was there and I knew things. I also started training people on the radio setup. The truck's radio rig was better than the facility's existing system, which had been improvised. I parked the truck inside the service gate and ran a cable to the facility's power system, and from the second day we had a proper monitoring setup on the interoperability frequencies. Information. Who else was out there? What was on the highways? Whether any government signals were still broadcasting anywhere in range. There were signals. Not many, not consistent, but they were there. On the third day after our arrival, 3 days into being inside the facility, I picked up a signal from a military frequency that I shouldn't have been able to access but could, because the truck's radio was built for emergency access, and the military had, in the chaos of the outbreak, been broadcasting on frequencies that overlapped with civilian emergency bands. The signal was automated, a looping broadcast, not a live voice, giving coordinates for a distribution point about 60 miles south, where, it said, The National Guard was maintaining a supply drop once every 48 hours. I told Harlan about it. He looked at the coordinates on the atlas for a while. Then he said, "Can you verify it's still active?" I said, "Not from here. Someone would have to drive south to verify." He said, "You're volunteering." I said, "The truck is designed for exactly this kind of run." "Yes." He said, "You just got here." I said, "I know how to operate in the field. I've been doing it for 12 days. And if that supply drop is real, it changes the situation for 400 people significantly. And for the 19 who just came in." He said, "Take someone with you." I took Donna. "And Rook," Claire said. "I'll be here when you get back." I said, "I know. Keep away from the equipment yard." She said, "That's not funny." I said, "It's a little funny." She said it was not, and I think she was right. The supply drop was real. I won't describe the entire drive south. It was a long day. A full tank of diesel, Donna navigating by atlas while I watched the road. Rook stationed at the window with his ears deployed. We found 2 infected on the way that we went around rather than through. We found a cluster of survivors at a crossroads town. 8 people who had been camping in a grain elevator, not knowing about Fairfield, and we loaded them into the truck bed and brought them back. That was an improvised decision. I made it without calling it in, because I didn't have radio contact with Fairfield at that range, and because 8 people in a grain elevator with no plan was not a situation I was willing to drive past. The supply drop itself was at a high school athletic field. 2 National Guard Humvees, 5 soldiers, a flatbed truck with pallets of supplies. They were there. They were real. They had food, MREs, canned goods, medical supplies, and they had fuel, and they had something even more valuable, a radio link to a coordination network that was, slowly, imperfectly, trying to build a picture of who was where and what they needed. The soldier running the drop was a sergeant named Decker. She was 26 years old, and she looked like someone who had been operating at maximum output for 2 weeks and had simply decided to keep going. She looked at me, looked at the truck, looked at the 8 people in the bed. She said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Fairfield Complex. We have about 420 people inside." She looked at me for a moment with an expression that had too many things in it to read quickly. She said, "We had Fairfield on our list as non-responsive. We sent a team 10 days ago and nobody answered their radio." I said, "The facility commander's been conservative with communications." She said, 420. I said, "Plus 8 I just picked up on the road." She said, "We can support that. With resupply, we can support a population that size. What do you need most?" I told her, "Fuel, medical supplies, and this was the thing I'd been thinking about for the entire drive south, testing equipment. The kind of testing that was better than Ellison's improvised protocol. Something that could distinguish between the V-strain slow infection and a false positive. Something that gave you an accurate answer." She said, "I don't have that, but I know someone who might." That conversation opened something. I'm not going to pretend the next 3 weeks were easy, or that the situation at Fairfield resolved into something clean. It didn't. Harlan and I had a disagreement on day 5 about supply prioritization. That was the specific kind of disagreement where both people are right about different things and wrong about others, and we came to something that was less a resolution and more a mutual recognition that the argument was less useful than the work. Douglas Kraft organized a security rotation that was more systematic than what Harlan's inner circle had been running. Pete Holloway spent 4 days running new electrical cable through the facility and gave us better lighting in the sleeping areas. Tasha set up a proper medical station next to Ellison's improvised one, and they were initially stiff with each other and then weren't. Ray Corman made bad jokes at moderately appropriate times and occasionally very inappropriate times, and people laughed at both kinds, which might be the most human thing I watched happen in those weeks. Helen Marsh, Helen, who had stood in the rain on the highway, who had said don't go there and they know, turned out to have been at a separate facility before Fairfield, a smaller one, farther west, that had collapsed from inside. She'd watched it collapse. She'd been walking east for 4 days by the time we found her. Her father, the man in the yard, was named Raymond Marsh, which Ray Corman thought was enormously funny, and Raymond Marsh did not. Helen started talking on day 2 inside Fairfield. Not a lot, not to everyone. But she talked to Claire, and eventually to me, and what she said was, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you more on the road. I thought you would stop. I thought if you knew what was inside, you would turn around." I said, "And you wanted to get to your father?" She said, "Yes." I said, "I wouldn't have stopped." She said, "I didn't know that then." I said, "If you'd told me what you knew, about the testing, about the yard, I could have been better prepared. It might have gone differently at the gate." She looked at me for a long time, and I thought she was going to say, "But it didn't go differently, it went fine." She didn't say that. She said, "You're right, I'm sorry." Which was the right answer, and the honest one, and I respected her for it. The proper testing equipment arrived on day 9 after our arrival at Fairfield. Sergeant Decker organized it. It came on the supply truck, along with a lab technician from a hospital that the Guard had been operating as a secondary facility 40 miles south. The lab tech's name was Priya Mehta, and she was one of the most practically useful people I'd encountered in the outbreak, which I told her and which she received with zero modesty, because she knew it was true. The test she ran was a blood panel, actual blood chemistry, looking for the specific protein marker of the V strain that Ellison's visual protocol had been trying to approximate. More accurate, significantly more accurate. She tested everyone in the facility over the course of 2 days. 5 people currently inside the facility tested positive for the V strain slow incubation profile. 5 out of 420. They were placed in a designated quarantine area that was properly set up, not an equipment yard, but a modified section of the facility, with walls and cots and food, and a medical monitor checking on them every 3 hours. Of the 5, 3 turned within the window, 2 didn't. The 2 who didn't were brought back into the main population on day 12. One of them was a 60-year-old woman named Barbara, who had been a librarian in Newark, and who, upon being cleared, went directly back to the organizational work she'd apparently been doing before quarantine, which was cataloging the facility's supply inventory. She treated the whole thing with a pragmatic matter-of-factness that suggested she had long since passed the point of being surprised by the world. The other was a 12-year-old boy who had been traveling with Douglas's group. Douglas had been treating him like a nephew. When the boy was cleared, Douglas shook his hand, which was not the response the boy expected, and then Douglas turned around and walked very quickly in the other direction, and was gone for about 10 minutes. When he came back, he didn't mention it. We didn't bring it up. I want to say something about the gate, about sitting outside it at 11:43 at night with the lights on and nobody coming. I understand, now that I'm on the inside, what Harlan was doing. Not just the logic of it, the emotional reality of it. He had built something, not just a physical space, though he'd done that too. He'd taken a functional industrial facility and turned it into a place where 400 people could sleep. He'd organized supply chains and security and medical care and water and food. And the thing he was most afraid of, the thing that would destroy all of it, was bringing the infection inside. And so he built a wall. Not just the container wall, a policy wall, a clean inside and a dirty outside, and no possibility of mixing them, because if you started mixing them, you started losing. I understand it. I disagree with it. I think the gate was a solvable problem, a different protocol, a proper holding area, a better test. But I don't think Harlan was a villain. I think he was a person running at the absolute edge of his capacity, who made a choice that felt necessary in the moment, and became a trap. The 19 people in the equipment yard were the trap's consequence. I don't know what would have happened to them if we hadn't come through the service access that night. I think about it sometimes. The most generous reading is that Harlan would have brought them in eventually, when his own discomfort with the situation became untenable. The less generous reading is that the equipment yard would have become a permanent feature of the facility's design. People who flagged the test stuck in the yard until they either turned or until time made the problem disappear in some other way. The least generous reading I try not to think about too long. There's one more thing I need to tell before I stop recording. On day 14 at Fairfield, 2 weeks after the 14th of September, which feels like a different calendar, a different unit of time measurement entirely, I went up to the roof of the main building with the hand radio, and I called on the frequency I'd used for 11 years. Not because I expected anyone to be there, because I wanted to say it somewhere it could be heard, even if only by the equipment. I said, "This is Owen Briggs, Columbus Emergency Dispatch, Unit 7, Fairfield Complex. We have 442 survivors. We have a working facility, water, food, medical capacity. We're here." I gave the coordinates. I gave the interoperability frequency. I said, "If anyone is listening, we're here." Static. Then, after about 45 seconds that I spent looking at the field around the facility in the morning light, the way it looked, flat and golden in the autumn, with nothing moving in it at the moment, just the grass and the sky, a voice. A woman's voice, faint, distant, carrying the specific quality of a signal that had bounced off something to get to me. She said, "Unit 7, this is transmission from Chillicothe Outpost. Copy. We copy your location. We are. Do you have?" The signal broke up. Parts of it were gone. But I heard, "We copy." 3 words, from somewhere that wasn't here, that meant, "You are not the last people in the world." I keyed the mic. I said, "Chillicothe Outpost. Unit 7 copies. We're at the Fairfield Complex. Come when you can." I sat on the roof for a while after that. Rook was up there with me. He'd followed me up and found a sunny section of roof to lie down in, which was very him. Maximum comfort in minimum conditions. I sat next to him with my back against a ventilation box and my face toward the sun, and I thought about Amy. I thought about her the way I try to think about her. Not the last text, not the silence that followed it, but before. A Sunday morning, 6 months before September, when we'd sat in the kitchen for 2 hours drinking coffee and not doing much of anything. She'd been reading. I'd been half reading. Rook had been asleep under the table with his chin on her foot, which he did when he thought she wasn't going to move anytime soon. The sun was doing that thing it does in March in Ohio, when it's the first real warm day after winter, and it comes through the window at exactly the right angle and makes the whole room look like an advertisement for something you'd actually want. I don't know what would have happened if she'd stayed home that morning. I know she wouldn't have. She was an ER nurse. People were hurt, and she knew how to help them, and she went. That's who she was. I think she would have known what to do about the gate. She always knew what to do, not in a dramatic way. She didn't have dramatic insights. She just had a very clear sense of what was the next right thing, and she did it, and she did the one after that, and somehow the accumulation of next right things always got her where she needed to be. I don't always have that. I have the dispatcher's version of it. Triage, prioritize, dispatch. Not quite the same. But I got Claire to hear. I got Donna and Pete and Ray and Tasha to hear. I got the 19 out of the equipment yard and into a building with heat and soup and a proper blanket. I got the Gratiot fire note read aloud at a Fairfield briefing meeting, so that when the firemen who'd written it heard about it, they could know it had reached someone. I don't know what comes next. Sergeant Decker's supply runs will continue for as long as the guard holds. Chillicothe is out there, signal broken but present. There are other facilities, other groups, other people, who have been trying in their own ways to do the next right thing. The gate's open now, the service gate at least. We keep the main gate locked because the infected are still in the fields and the world is still what it is. But we built a proper check station at the service access. Priya Mehta's blood test, a 24-hour quarantine for new arrivals, a holding area with walls and cots and food, and a doctor who comes to check, not an equipment yard in September. Anyone who comes now, we open it. Rook has gotten fat. I want to note this for the record. Not significantly fat. Comfortable fat. The kind of fat that happens when a working dog suddenly has access to regular meals and people who like to feed him scraps from the kitchen because he sits next to them and looks hopeful. He still does his perimeter checks. I still run him around the facility's inner perimeter twice a day, and he still checks every corner, and every gap in the container joins with the thoroughness of a very serious professional. But he does it with slightly more leisurely enthusiasm than he used to. He sleeps at the foot of my bunk. He takes up more room than he has any right to. Claire is 4 bunks down in the same sleeping area. She falls asleep with her light on because she's been doing that since she was about 7 years old, and apparently the zombie apocalypse hasn't changed it. The first few nights I kept waking up and checking that the light was still on. Now I just wake up, check, and go back to sleep. Ray has 2 friends. This surprised everyone. He found 2 other people with bad knees, and they sit together at meals and compare their orthopedic histories with the enthusiasm of people who have found their tribe. Pete has become indispensable to the facility's electrical system, and he knows it, and it has done something good for him, given him a way of standing that he didn't have before, a particular squareness in how he holds himself when he's working on something. Donna keeps the notebook. She writes things down, daily counts, supply levels, decisions made and why, names of the people who've arrived. She said to me once, someone should be keeping track of all this, of who was here and what happened. I said, yes. She said, well, someone is. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Douglas runs security with the same flat efficiency he runs everything, and Marcus, the man from the radio, Harlan's aide, has become, strangely, one of the better people on the overnight watch rotation. I don't know how to explain that transformation, and I'm not sure it needs explaining. People are what the moment requires them to be. Sometimes the moment requires something better than what they've been. Harlan is still here, and still running logistics, which he is genuinely good at. And at the council meetings, he is quieter than he used to be. He defers more. Not entirely. He still has opinions and he states them, but he holds them less hard, lets them be questioned. I don't know if that's growth or exhaustion, and I'm not sure there's a practical difference. One morning last week, I passed him in the corridor near the medical station, and he said, "Your sister's good people." I said, "Yeah, she is." He said, "I'm glad she's here." I said, "I know." It was a strange conversation. It was also the only real conversation we've had about what happened in the equipment yard. I don't know if there will be another one. I'm not sure there needs to be. What was done, and what needs doing now is different. The sun's up now. Thursday. 1 month exactly from the 14th. I'm going to stop recording because the morning briefing starts in 20 minutes, and I need to eat something and drink an actual cup of coffee, which we have because Pete found an industrial coffee urn in a storage room last week, and it has been treated with an almost religious reverence by the entire facility. I don't know what the recording is for. I said that at the beginning. I still don't know. Maybe it's for whoever comes through the service gate next. Maybe it's for me, to hear my own voice saying, "I was here. I did this. It mattered." Maybe it's for a world I'm not sure is still listening. But I'm going to keep recording. Because that's what dispatchers do. We stay on the line. We keep talking until someone picks up. The lights are still on at Fairfield. The gate is open for people who pass the test, and the wait, and who knock and mean it. Nobody out there should have to stand in the dark wondering if anyone's home. We're home. We're here. Unit 7 out.